Hello everyone, MasterZeon1001 here, and in this video I want to go over some of the changes that have happened with HardOps 00987_2. This has been a mainly utilitarian update aiming to just solve some of the quality of life issues that may come up for your use, and if you're running into issues in 2.93 then this is the update for you, because we've definitely taken a lot of work and care into making sure everything works fluidly for 2.93 because there were quite a few issues that came up. There's also a few new things being introduced in this version. The main theme of it was recursion, adding recursion support to most of our tools. However, we also bring about Polygon Debug, which is new and is a new way to display polygons, tries, and n-gons in your 3D view, assisting you with getting your meshes cleaned up. But without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into this and get started. So with the official release of 2.92 began our trek into 2.93. As many of you know, Hops has a custom modal warp that can be opted into via the opt-ins area where there's a modal warp. We'll press Q and jump into bevel, and if I hold Control and just scroll the wheel in order to change which bevel I'm affecting, you see that right now I'm able to move the mouse and I'm able to affect the bevel as you would normally expect. However, notice that the moment that I move it outside the area, the mouse will actually get stuck in a state where it can no longer re-enter the 3D view, which also makes mouse movement next to impossible in this particular state. This was something that was new to 2.93 and was something that was a little bit of annoyance and was actually close to almost holding off this release. However, at the last moment we managed to get it resolved, and I'm happy to announce that modal warp has now been resolved for the latest version of Blender, so now you'll be able to get in and warp to your heart's content without any issues whatsoever once you update to 987_2. In this version, I'm actually using the latest version of HardOps, which we can see by just expanding and clicking on the About button. We're using _2. And from here, if I press Q and go under bevel, hold Control and roll the wheel to adjust the primary bevel, we see that I'm able to move the mouse and it just wraps nicely, going from edge to edge, allowing me to continuously get the proper movement that I need without any sort of interruption. So for this example, I'll be using 2.83.10 just for kicks. We of course support all current active versions of Blender, but with this, we'll just take this cube, just press SZ, and we'll duplicate this cube, just move it over, and SX, and cut that in. And while we have this shape still here, we're going to duplicate it and just make a cutter. Duplicate and select both of these and perform a difference as well, just so we can cut inside of our cutter, getting a more unique shape. And then we can just duplicate this cutter and just scale it down, and we'll just cut like so, just performing a difference on the main shape. So most of these shapes are affecting the main shape. However, this shape, as you may recall, is affecting a cutter. So it's not actually a target of the main shape. It's actually a component of one of the cutters itself. So when we talk about recursion support, we're talking about actually supporting the cutters that are outside of the normal sphere of influence of objects that are just going to be listed in the modifier panel whenever you perform Booleans. So if you were to go in and perform Uniquify, it would duplicate the cutters, but we see that it ignores the actual cutter itself. And in fact, the proper way to use Uniquify is to duplicate the object and then run the operation. So if I were to Shift D and then press Q and use Uniquify, I should basically be able to move this shape, and this shape should look exactly like this shape. And we see in this example it actually doesn't, because there's cutters associated with particular cutters that isn't being taken into account. So I'm hoping that that's making sense and you're following me. So I'm just going to copy the shape itself, not even bother with the cutters, and we'll minimize this, going to 2.93. And because all that data is connected, it's going to grab all the cutters anyways. But I just want to show that now if we were to Shift D, duplicate this, press Q and go under operations and choose Uniquify, The tooltip also says that it now is recursive, so when we click that, it means that whenever we duplicate the shape and we move it up, we actually have all the cutters taken into account. And that's just the start of our support with basically recursive cutting behaviors and allowing you to recall these in the latest version of HardOps. So Everscroll also supports recursion. So to show that in action, I'm just going to press numpad 1, then numpad 7, look at it from top view. And we're just going to scale this cube out. And I'm just going to press D, switch over to Ngon, and just begin cutting some shapes. However, I do want to, of course, make sure I don't have taper on. So that way our shapes are perfectly linear. And I'll shift it to live, and we'll just move this shape over. And with it being live, we can actually just kind of draw in a trigger pattern, and we'll cut this in, but we want to tab it to live and move the cutter in just a little bit. So this one is a cutter that's cutting the main shape, but this cutter that we're working on is actually a cutter that's cutting the cutter itself, affecting the result that we're going to get back from the cutter that's cutting into the mesh. And this is a really interesting way to work in kind of a layered approach when it comes to dealing with Booleans. So if I were to select this shape, we could press Q, and we see that we're able to just go ahead and scroll through the Booleans whenever we jump into Everscroll. However, there's also additional hotkeys, as you can see over in the help, for R to start recursive scroll, Shift R to stop recursive scroll, and S to show recursive Booleans. So this first shape doesn't actually have any recursive Booleans. If we were to press S, it'll tell us that there's no recursive objects for this to show. If we were to jump to the next one and we were to press S, we see that it actually revealed one Boolean, which is now showing, and if we were to click, we'll have our selection of basically both of these Booleans. But let's actually take this opportunity and press R, and now we can actually recursively scroll. And because there's only one object in this scroll, there's really not a lot of scrolling to have happening here, but just letting you know that we now support recursiveness inside of Everscroll. And I'll be doing a video more in depth talking about Everscroll and its expectations of what you can expect from it in the future. However, just giving you a small glimpse of recursion being a thing inside of Everscroll. The following cube on screen was being used for a test of the recursive scroll process as it was being put together by our very own ST3. If I were to press Q and we jump into Everscroll, we can just scroll through these Booleans, and it's no big deal, it's just a bunch of Booleans. However, this one is a Boolean that's comprised of multiple shapes. So if we were to press tab, we can go into expanded mode, where we can still scroll and jump through these, and we can even click to select it in the list like we would normally do, shift click in order to append to visibility. However, you can also take this time to click on, let's see where it's talking about S, show recursive, and it will begin showing the recursive Booleans for you to be able to begin looking through those and choose if you want to add those to visibility. However, if I were to scroll, notice that they've been appended to the visibility, and we have another example in here as well. This particular shape is also one that has recursive Booleans on it, meaning that there's cutters affecting the cutter to give it a very particular result. So if we were to just click on the S, we see that we bring back the shapes for that as well. So if we were to just click and apply, we can then go in and actually grab the cutters of our cutters to begin making fine adjustments to the cutters as they're being perceived by the target object. So whenever it comes to Inset always requires that I give a small talk about the integrals of how it works so that you can best understand how to get a good experience with it. And one of the fun things I love to talk about with Inset is how you can just have a itty bitty cut in some area, and it will affect the success of your inset from that moment forward for the rest of that mesh. So we have this little cut here, we have this cube. If we select both of these, we can just go under Booleans in the queue and just choose inset. And notice that the inset did not work out. And so we can dial this back in order to, kind of get something that's actually visual and that we see on screen, but the mesh is so deformed and tore up that it's just not going to work out for us. And so you as a user might be wondering, hey, why does it look so bad? And more importantly, how can I do something about this to actually get a more manageable result to continue on with my work? So let's take a moment and analyze this. So if we press /, we can take this into local mode. And this is where the Everscroll troubleshooting portion begins. So if we just shift click, we can jump this in through the state. So this is the mesh unmodified. And then we see there's a difference for a Boolean. and then there's a solidification, and then it's given this intersect. But where it goes wrong is this Boolean that's been given. So this Boolean isn't being taken into account by the inset at all. So it's not actually necessary. Let's roll back one, and let's just press A to toggle that, and then let's do solidify, and then let's do intersect, and let's click and come out of local mode with /, and now we see that we get a much better result. So there's a technical way that you can deal with inset in order to get this thing under control, to be able to manage any sort of geometry. But just know that if we were to have this single Boolean on, the result can be night and day. And this is just part of how Blender works, and more importantly, how it's part of how inset works. And I'm always contemplating how inset could be made better. But really, I'm getting off on a tangent. But the most important part of this whole thing is that inset now has support for basically slashing. So that means that at this moment I could take this piece, and if I were to just go under my settings and just, I could change it to a join, but if I were to change it back to inset, there's actually an F9 option in here I can choose for something called Inset Slice. So all of these lessons that I just taught about how you can manage your shape, you will definitely doubly need to take them into account when it comes to Inset Slice, because now a slice has been made of this mesh, but we still have problems with this mesh. So we want to press Q, go into Everscroll, which will automatically bring you back your last Boolean that you had up. And then from here in the modifier panel, we can just disable that lone modifier, and we have a very beautiful slice coming out of this surface. And slice is just fun in itself. This was something that was on the whiteboard for the longest time, so long that it became what I call dry ink. So I'm happy to see that this finally got resolved. In fact, this will also be coming to the next version of Box Cutter, where users will be able to perform inset slicing, where basically you get a very narrow slice off of the surface that's actually contoured to it. So here you're seeing me use it in sort of a kind of boxy formation. However, if I were to press Control N and make a new file, we can press Q, go under Mesh Tools, and choose Sphere Cast. One of my favorite ways to turn a cube to a sphere. We'll press Control 4 just to raise our sub D up to 4. And let's also sharpen this, except we don't want to sharpen it because it will crease the edges. We just want to mark it as smooth. And also turn on auto smooth while we're looking at this. We'll Shift A, add a cube, and let's just bring it out. And you might be wondering why I'm using HardOps to do all these Booleans instead of Box Cutter. And it's because HardOps Booleans definitely have the added benefit of being a lot more technical versus Box Cutter, where we try to simplify it to its simplest terms. So here we are performing our inset. We'll press F9 and deal with our thickness, and from here we'll choose Inset Slice. And if we press Alt Z, we can see through and see that we've created a contoured slice based on the surface of the inset, and this is where the fun really just gets started. So if we were to Shift D, bring this out, we can select both of these, press Q, choose difference, and we have a shape kind of happening here. And as we scale it, we get more and more of this shell just taken away, which is always fun to see. We'll just press 1 to remove any part of our collections that isn't the main one. And I'm just going to bring in a cube, scale it around, fit it where I want, bring it out. We don't want to penetrate it fully always. We could press Q, Everscroll, roll the wheel just to get our cutter back. In fact, with Everscroll, it's defaulted to give you your last cutter on first scroll. So you don't even have to roll the wheel a single time. It will automatically give you your last cutter, just showing a little bit about how great Everscroll is. So we're going to control click radial array in order to radial array this around on the Z. Press X a couple of times in order to change the axis, and it's just not going to fly. So we're going to need to apply the scale, and then let's control click radial array. And now we can press X until it arrays around the correct axis. And we're using a 3D cursor in this case, but just like that, you're able to create really interesting shapes just using radial array and the new inset shell feature. However, we're calling it Inset Slice. So I'm just going to Shift deduplicate this in edit mode, of course, so that way we still keep the control of our radial arrays. And we'll just bring that out and just set it up like so. And that's really just the start of getting started when it comes to Inset Slice. So to show it one more time in action, if you were to Shift deduplicate your cube, you can press Q, and under Booleans, there's an option for Inset Outset. And first you want to go in and adjust your inset to be just right, because visually you need to be on top of this. And then from here, you can choose Inset Slice. One of the things I regrettably was not able to get taken care of in this particular update was the ability for us to bool shift into it. So just letting you know, let's say we delete this shape and then we bring back Everscroll on this and we decide to shift bool. So by rolling the wheel, I'm able to roll through possible types of booleans. Here I'm looking at an outset where I can press T and adjust my thickness. I can roll the wheel, go to inset, press T, and adjust the thickness of that as well. However, there is no ability to get an inset slice. And so this is something that I found to be a bit of an oversight. However, we'll just need to double back for that in the future. However, more than likely, the easiest way at this time in order to shift into an inset slice, if you're the type of person who's trying to do all these sort of large changes after the fact, is you would just select your target, Q, shift bool, and just roll down to inset. And then using the F9, you can of course get your thickness just right, but there will be an option in the F9 for inset slice. So this is a kind of lesser used option, but just letting you know that it's not one of those things that you'll be able to shift into like you normally would. It's something that is exclusive to the F9 due to the types of behaviors and newness of the system in Boxcutter and HardOps at this time. So the concept of select tool, which is located under mark when you shift click it, was to make something that was useful for people on a laptop where you could basically make a selection and just control scroll the wheel in order to grow your selection. You could click in an area and then control grow in order to grow it. Just really quickly just have control over your selections. However, by pressing X, you can cycle through a multitude of tools that are available inside of the multi-tool that we're talking about today. And one of them that is a big favorite of mine is merge, where you can just press X, jump to merge, and just click on a point and just click on 2 points in order to merge them in an area. This is something that I find myself doing all the time. In fact, I also like pressing X to switch back over to select as a tool, where I can then select a single edge by pressing 2, similar to Blender, holding shift, selecting another one, pressing X to change my tool over to dissolve. We can even click to dissolve them or just dissolve them through the hotkey of dissolve, but just letting you know that the multi-tool is a lot more than just selecting. And now, instead of just starting the tool by jumping into select every time, there's now an option inside of Control K where if you want, you can specify the multi-tool start state. So if you want to start in a knife and have select tool just be a fast knife tool, you can. Or if you want to be a fast spin tool or a merge tool, you can do that instead of having to go through the rigmarole of pressing various hotkeys. However, there are some differences to various states. For example, if you have your start tool set as merge, you will not be able to get in and just press B to perform a spacer bevel like I would. For example, this is something I found out the hard way. You just shift click multi-tool, and if I were to press B, you see that no bevel's happening. However, if I were to press X and jump over to say select, I can press B, and now you see my bevel actually coming into existence. So this was something that actually threw me off throughout the testing process. So I'm just letting you know that if you do make a change to your start state of your tool, that certain hotkeys won't be available for that particular tool, because only in select tool would you be dealing with things like converting faces to tris and to quads and cleaning your selection, so forth. Meanwhile, modes like spin are focused exclusively on spin, and merge is all about consolidating geometry, along with join just being a quick way to create lines directly between geometry, similar to selecting 2 points and pressing J. But just letting you know that if you're a big fan of the select multi-tool, that there's now an option for you to set your start tool inside of the Control K preferences of HardOps. So I'm going to show you an interesting situation that resulted in what I interpreted initially to be a sort of bug. So I'm just going to scale this cube down, and we'll just perform a couple of extrusions. We'll extrude this face, scale it down. We'll grab this edge and bevel it just to round it out, and then we'll just sharpen it, but we'll skip the sharpening. In fact, we'll just go and just click on auto smooth and 30, and that'll do the job. So the next thing is I'm going to Shift A, insert a cylinder, and you know, if you're following along closely, you might have noticed that I made a mistake at a previous point, but we're going to pretend that that mistake didn't happen. So the next thing is I'm going to scale this cylinder, and of course when I try to bevel it, the bevel is going to be oblong, and that's because I need to apply the scale on the cylinder in order to perform a proper bevel on it. So now that I've beveled this, we can now take these two pieces and union them together. So now everything's unioned together. However, the mesh looks absolutely terrible. So I'm going to go into Everscroll, and of course I'm going to put a loop here and here just to kind of alleviate this transitional area. And we still have this shape looking absolutely terrible. And visually you would think, hey, there's nothing wrong with this because I have went through all the work of ensuring that the bevels in there are right. If the thing was scaled incorrectly, the bevel wouldn't look right on this part. You know, it's like a kind of an optical illusion. I hope I'm explaining this correct. But we'll just press Shift D, and I'm just going to press Control A, Visual Geometry to Mesh. This version is still non-destructive, but this version has everything applied. And so if we were to press Q and Sharpen, we see that now Sharpen will display a warning letting you know that scale has been unapplied. And it will show this for everything. So if I were to C-sharpen this, it will also let me know that scale has been unapplied, which lets me know that this mesh is going to give me inaccurate results. Sometimes I'll be working with a cylinder and I'll get this weird seam down the middle. Whenever I'm sharpening, I don't know why it happens. And it turns out it's because of the scale. So even if I go in and I unmark this, this was like a conundrum that we talked about internally for quite a few hours before I finally realized that the problem was due to me being a nitwit. So we'll change this, and we'll even raise the auto smooth angle to something like 117. And so now we're able to get this to shade right, but really this is a ridiculous amount of modification to have to do just because our scale wasn't applied. And so it's important that Sharpen notifies you that scale is just unapplied. It's a heavy-handed procedure for us to apply your scale for you. We've done it in the past with things like bevel, but really we shouldn't be doing that all around for all our tools because it's just not right. It'll cause issues with instances and all sorts of interesting little tidbits. So let's take this and Control A, apply to scale, and instead of sharpening it, let's press Q and Control Shift click this, which will use something called resharp. And we see that now it's sharpened properly and there's no hideous seam happening down the middle. So just letting you know that this was something that you may run into every now and then whenever you're modeling and sharpening with unapplied scale, and that special care has been taken to let Sharpen at least be a notifier of your scale being unapplied versus it'll just show as normal whenever there's not an issue with your scale that may affect the ability for Sharpen to do its job. So when it comes to mirror, if you have an object selected, you can just press Alt X and it'll bring up our mirror tool. And symmetry is one that is built to just mirror and be done. In fact, it's optimized to work its best with heavy, high poly geometry. However, there's another option called Mod Apply. So I'm just going to press Alt X, bring up mirror, and Alt Scroll to Modifier Apply. And this one will actually put a mirror modifier and then apply it, and that's it. However, one thing that's always driven me crazy is that if I were to use these mirroring tools in edit mode, it will always return me to object mode. In fact, here I am returned to object mode. If I go to edit mode again and I press Alt X and we go to symmetrize, we see that whenever we perform the operation, it actually returns us to object mode. In fact, let's undo both of those mirrors and let's just press Alt X and let's just double symmetrize, and we see that even after the first symmetrize operation, I was returned back to object mode. And this is something that's a small nuance that has driven me crazy, and I'm just letting you know that it's been resolved in the latest version of HardOps. So if we minimize this, we can now go over to the latest version of Blender that's actually using 987_2. And if we select this edge and bevel it, we can press Alt X, and if we jump over to symmetry, we can shift click it and see that it keeps us in edit mode. Now, one of the interesting behaviors of mirror that I enjoy is the selection behavior of using symmetry in edit mode. For example, I have this selection of geometry. If I were to press Alt X and perform a symmetry, we see that it symmetrized the geometry, but it also deselected any geometry that I had. And that's cool and all, but that isn't actually what I want. So let's press Alt X and let's go to symmetry, or let's go to modifier apply. And so if I were to click, we see that it keeps my selection. And if I click it again, it continues to keep my selection. And this is good for times where, let's say I want to right click and cancel, and I want to press Shift tilde to select my boundary loop, and then just go in and do something like Shift click EM macro in order to just push these edges in and perform a panel cut. It just allows me to do that very quickly, even with my selection, just using symmetry. So sometimes I'll just be working and I'll just be, creating a shape on one side, and I just want to keep everything selected. So I will just have something selected, press Alt X, modifier apply to have it on all sides, and then I just know that if I were to say Shift click curve extract to extract this out into another piece, that it'll extract all sides. So it's just a little bit of interesting information about just how Mirror behaves with varying types of selections, but also just letting you know that it's been improved to support edit mode and keeping you in edit mode whenever you use it, instead of ejecting you back out into object mode. So as of the last update to Box Cutter, we made it where whenever you begin performing cuts, there will be a collection marked in red of cutters. Normally it would just be generic, but we made it where it would make it show up in red, as you can see over here on the side. However, in this particular update of HardOps, if you were to press Ctrl K and bring up your props, over in color there's an option for collection display where you can choose what sort of collection is made off the bat. Just know that this works for only when you first instantiate the collection. It doesn't actually work where if you go in and say change your collection color to something like violet and you perform another cut, it won't actually change the collection color. So it's only for the first time creation of the collection. So if we just delete the hierarchy and then we perform a cut again, we can see that now we have a purple collection for our cutters. And in the next Box Cutter update, it should also have a prop for its collection color as well. Just know that you can always right click your collection at the top and just color code it, which was something that I wasn't aware of, but it was pointed out to me very recently by Imperfect Link with his recent keyboard kit that he came out with. So LinkOps is the successor of PizzaOps and can be located by pressing Q, going under Settings, and just clicking on the option titled LinkOps. And now you'll notice that whenever you bring it up, the first option will take you to the release log of this release, so you can quickly find out what's new to this particular update. However, you can also scroll through it for particular links that will take you to various areas that may help you in your adventures, or also just give you directions for just various types of content that might be worth checking out. In fact, I even added a link for the keyboard kit that's being featured on this particular kiosk pictured here. So on screen I have a plethora of objects selected. You can see that they're all very different objects. So what I'll do is go under the Q menu, and under operations I will just alt click on Smart Apply, or actually I want to shift click it in order to perform a Smart Apply duplicate, and we'll just press Z and move this up, and I'll just press Ctrl J to join all this together. And now we can actually go in Mesh Tools and use Dice, and we'll just perform a dice using, it looks like Knife Project as our default. So we'll just click to perform a knife project. And from here I can just Shift S, snap my cursor, and press Shift A and add a circle, or a Bezier circle to be exact. And so by selecting both of these, there will be a Q menu option for curve modifier. So just by clicking it, you'll be able to quickly set up a curve modifier, similar to if you went Control P, except there is an F9. Previously we didn't have Axial controls for negatives, which was just a small oversight on our side, so just letting you know that that's been resolved. So you can quickly get in and actually scroll holding control over this to quickly get the axis that you want whenever it comes to performing curve deformation. Of course, keep in mind that when you're deforming things along a curve, that the resolution of the curve can also affect it. So while this looks all right on this deformation, you could press Q and actually increase the resolution, which will remove the faceting. So you can see a little bit of shadow faceting happening. Notice how it goes away as I drag it up to something like 64, and it definitely goes away whenever I jump to something like 128. But just letting you know that we're working on improving our curving workflows inside of HardOps, and having a better way to connect with the curve modifier is one of the first steps. So when it comes to bugs, I was pretty sure that Array V2 was on its way. One of my favorite things about using Array V2 is pressing V in order to go into 3D mode, where when you roll the wheel, you can actually add them in between. However, there was an error where if you scrolled it all the way down past a negative point, you would run into a division by zero, which should open a black hole and annihilate the universe. However, we'll just minimize this version of Blender and go back to the one that we were on previously. And I'm just going to press Control N and make a new file, and we'll just paste the object that we had before. And we'll press Q, go under Array V2, and press V, and we now see that we're able to scroll all the way up and all the way down, and there's no longer a division by zero error. So just letting you know that we also got that resolved. So whenever it comes to Booleans, you can just, in this case, I'm just going to Shift D, duplicate this cube, and then Shift select the main shape. I'll press Q, and we'll just use a difference operation. So whenever you perform a Boolean operation object mode, you can press F9, and there's a option here that'll let you choose the type of operations being performed. It'll let you select if sorting is enabled, if you have parenting to parent the shape to the object. All sorts of options are available. However, if we go in edit mode and we Shift D, duplicate this cube, and we were to press Q and go under Booleans and perform a difference, we press F9, we see that there's not a lot of options when it comes to edit mode and Booleans. So this is something that we've sought to address. So I'll just minimize this version of Blender. And now we can see that if I were to tap into edit mode and we Shift deduplicate this and just press Control numpad minus to just perform a Boolean operation, we can press F9 and we see that as of Blender 2.91 and higher that there's an option between the fast and exact solver that can be useful. There's an option for keep cutters in case you want to keep your cutter and then reuse it somewhere else, and press Control Alt numpad minus and continue reusing the same cube in edit mode in order to perform the operation. So we can see that the shape never disappears unless I turn off keep cutters, and then we can see that it does go away. However, it also has caused a little bit of an issue here in edit mode. In fact, to resolve that, let's just select this edge selection and just Control X dissolve it. In fact, I'm not sure what this edge is connected to or this one. They're both quite strange, and we'll have to go. So we'll just press M, merge these at last, and we'll just select these two and just merge those and try to dissolve it. And it seems like it's still giving us a hard time with removing that. And part of Blender are these kind of curiosities that can happen when it comes to edit mode. However, I spent a large part of my day actually attempting to break down why these sort of issues occur and understand what pitfalls get in the way of users. So now we're back to where we started. I can Shift right click, place my cursor, and then bring in another cube, and when we press Control Alt numpad minus, we see that we're able to have the cutter disappear, which is the normal expected behavior. But sometimes it'll get a little weird if you choose to keep cutters and then you try to turn it off in the middle of the operation. So here we are able to use it, but if we go in the F9 and we choose to turn it off, then in this case it actually worked. But let's turn it back on, and it looks like it's just going to make a fool of me. So I guess that's life. But just letting you know that now in edit mode, whenever you perform Booleans, there's now an option that you can bring up with F9 after the operation to allow you to change the options that are probably pertinent to your experience. Sometimes using exact in cases where it's not necessarily called can give you rather undesirable results. So it was rather imperative that we had this first and foremost in front of the user for them to quickly change on the fly when applicable. Last but not least, I would like to talk about Polygon Debug and tri-quad N-gon display mode. So whenever you're working, the moment that I cut this face, I've created N-gon. I've also created another N-gon. These faces are all quads, but I've created N-gons. The moment I cut in the middle of a face, like this face is a quad, the moment I cut into it, it's now an N-gon. Everything inside of this is a quad, but everything around this is an N-gon. And there's a lot of ways you can go about solving this. This isn't really to talk about topology, but it's really that easy to create geometry that can be problematic. So we've had a system in HOPS for a long time where you can go under mesh tools and under selection options, you can choose to display N-gons and tris. And we see that with it turned on, we're not able to see anything. And that's until we press Control A and do visual geometry to mesh, and then it'll show, but it's not showing. And that's because we need to actually go in here, hide it, and then go in and actually turn it on again. And now we see in red all the areas that are N-gons. Previously in 2.79, we would be able to work, and you would actually see it update in real time as you would mess with the geometry, making it into quads. For example, this area that I just beveled is a quad face, but it's still showing in red. So I have to go here, hide it, and display it again. So toggling that off and on is something that will definitely get old very fast. So I'm happy to announce in this version that we can just turn that off, but there's now an option called Polygon Debug. Of course, this is a V1, so there still may be issues that may be found by the user. But as you can see, as I'm working and applying the modifiers, that it will update in real time, letting me know the status of this particular mesh. For example, if I were to put a bevel on here and then press 3 to change it to a sub D conversion bevel, now there's a quad edge surrounding all the perimeter, and I can begin dealing with things. In fact, I may want to take this and push it back, and we may want to press Alt V and turn on wireframe. It's a little confusing seeing it in a non-derived state showing you status, but this is actually the truth of your mesh. If you have modifiers on it, it won't actually update to let you know, and that's because it'll just get too slow with the depth graph at this time, according to testing. So let's just press Control A, visual geometry to mesh, and we see that everything is now protected by a perimeter, and these perimeters are all quads, except over here we have a little bit of overlap. So the easiest way to deal with that is to just slide this geometry respectively away from each other. Over here we got the geometry just kind of looking a little crooked, so we can just straighten that out. We can grab this whole area SZ and start straightening that out. But now that we have this perimeter that's protecting everything, besides the areas that are skewed, which is kind of strange to see, we can just, adjust our snapping, just get these areas looking absolutely right, and more than likely they are skewed because of the lack of guidance edges to ensure that the results didn't get skewed by the guidance of the bevel. So even though you could work a little lazy like this, it still is going to cause some issues, but it's always nice after the fact to go in and just double check and make sure that you don't have any overlap in geometry, because if anything's going to come back and cause you issues, it's definitely going to be some overlapping bevels. That's something that no level of sub D will solve. So now that we have the geometry looking somewhat adequate, we can actually take this to the next level, which the next level is actually putting a triangulate on it. And let's just apply the geometry, and we see that everything turned yellow, and that's because everything is a triangle. We select everything, we press Alt J, which should actually turn everything into a quad. I believe it's Alt J. Maybe it's not. Alright, let's try it again. Select everything, Alt J, and then from here we can change the max face angle under shape to grab a little bit more. So this is how much we're able to kind of jump to quads. However, at this point, we could try to jump this all to quads, but we could also just put a level of sub D on it, and because of the way that we've reinforced all our boundaries, the shape's able to hold itself together. And this is like some old school sub D talk right here about just how easy it is. You can go from n-gons and quads over to a subdivision model. So now we'll go ahead and apply a level of subdivision, and we see that besides a couple of skews in some areas where things just did not work out adequately, we can actually go back a step and see this area about to begin to fall. And so how can we get around such things? So for me personally, I would actually begin cutting loops in this, but as long as we have the derived geometry showing on top, it's going to be a little deceptive. So I'm just going to use box cutter, Control K, jump over to knife, and we can just solve problems by adding problems. 1, 2, 3 at last, and we could even do it one more time right here. And we just want to grab this geometry, turn this off and slide them to. And now if we come out, we look at what our sub D is giving us, we can actually turn off wireframe and just look at just the object. However, with the weird shading, it's also a little bit hard to read, so we can go under Q, Mesh Tools, and under Selection Options, just turn off Polygon Debug and just look at the surface. And what we're looking at here is basically a mesh that's on the verge of being converted into a sub D friendly mesh. I mean, this isn't like a great trick or anything. This is just Blender in general and how it works with these modifiers and getting things converted, because you apply one level of sub D and everything's going to become a quad. And so just by assisting the geometry a little bit, you can actually mitigate it in converting over to being subdivision friendly rather easily. However, you know, topological rules become the law of the land once you begin working like this. In fact, for this area, I just see that just having a region cut out there will just help this hold a little bit tighter whenever it comes to subdivision. But just letting you know that whenever it comes to dealing with topology, that we're beginning to work on some of our debugging and troubleshooting tools. And Polygon Debug, while it is new, it is something that we're working on to try to make the steps of finding and fixing geometry just a little bit easier. Every now and then a user writes me and he says, hey, it's so weird snapping the 3D cursor to edges and faces. And in this update, there's been some changes to make that a little bit easier. So just to kind of show that in action, I'm just going to bevel this edge. And we're just going to select this edge and press Ctrl S and snap our cursor here. I'm using snapping pies, of course, which uses Blender's own snapping. But notice that even though the cursor snapped here, it's like snapped at an angle kind of perpendicular to the view, not really aligned to this edge, which has always been a little problematic. So if you press QOS, you'll be able to use something called snap cursor, which is part of hops, just QOS, and the cursor will be snapped to an edge. And this can be assistive for times where you're just trying to use Boxcutter's grid alignment system with cursor as your orientation method. You might want to go in and actually just orient it to a plane like you see me doing here, where you just want to select the edge and just press QOS and actually snap your cursor and orient it to that particular edge. So just to show some examples of why one would want to do this, just to wrap this up, we'll snap our cursor here, and we'll just change our orientation mode in Boxcutter to cursor. And so now whenever I draw a box, I'm oriented to the cursor. However, more than likely I need to find the right axes. In this case, it is X. So notice that even though I'm drawing literally off of the surface a great distance, that it still is being oriented to the cursor. And sometimes people actually want to work in this way, where they have the cursor being their orientation point and they're able to just work very far offset from the surface in order to create really interesting cuts starting from a great distance away. Not me personally, cursor is something that's always been a point of contingency with Boxcutter and me personally. However, we will be revisiting grid in the future to bring hopefully all of these things back to fulfill all the user requests that have come up over time. But for now, just know that cursor has been expanded inside of HardOps. You can just press QOS in edit mode and snap to a selected edge, but only an edge. If you try with the face, it will not work out for you. But here you can see me just drawing off the mesh and just orienting it to the 3D cursor. So I figured for the conclusion we could talk about making a spherical. Sphericals are just one of those kind of tool tests that I do in HardOps just to kind of test things and just see how things are performing. It's like a knuckle popper of sorts. So really users shouldn't struggle with this process, for it is just a process that one could go through to test the tools to make sure they're working the way they're supposed to. So we'll start off with a sphere cast, except I'll jump it up to level 4 as I often do in order to get a smooth result. We'll click on the auto smooth button and just 30 in order to auto smooth it at 30. Pretty much the same as if we sharpened it. However, if we were to sharpen it, this would happen, which we don't want to happen. That's as a result of us creasing the edges, which makes sub D and cast work a little bit harder to get a spherical shape, and that's why it's actually bigger than usual. So we'll just select both of these, and under Booleans we'll choose Inset. And with our inset on this very simple shape, we can adjust our parameters and everything's pretty dynamic. I did a video previously where I was talking about HardOps versus Boxcutter and just kind of how we have a bit of overlap between both of them in order to allow us to try unique solutions with each of them to try to have multiple iterations at the same idea. So while I have this shape that's now receiving inset and a slice, I'm going to uniquify it so that way I can perform an Everscroll and bring the shape back. And I'm just going to turn off visibility so I can press Q and adjust the solidification. And we see that by adjusting the solidification of this uniquified cutter, we actually put a shell around this. And I'm going to try to keep things brief for this so that way this video doesn't get too long. But next thing from here is I'm just going to Shift A, add a cube. I almost jumped into Boxcutter, old habits die hard. And we'll just select both of these and perform a difference. And using the F9, we could choose whether we want our solver to be fast or exact, but just know that if you use exact, it's going to get a lot slower over the course of you continuing to use Blender. So usually I use fast for as long as possible, and only exact if I absolutely need it. So looking at this from the top, we're just going to add another cube, and we'll just Shift A, select them both, and just perform a difference, which will give us a result something like this. And we can just perform an Everscroll with Booleans and just recall this and perform a difference, and we see that something just did not work out here. So we move this around and we see that it works in some areas but not in others, which is quite strange. I wasn't expecting such catastrophe, but let's roll with it. So continuing on, we'll just look at this from the top, and I'm just going to add another cube, and we'll just grab these two objects and perform a slice through our Q menu. Everything's always delegated to the Q menu in these videos. And from here, we can also just bring in another cube. Just notice how I'm just always using cubes. It kind of is old school now at this point to do things this way when I know that I can just use box cutter and really just make mincemeat of a mesh in moments. But it's also fun to just go without. So here we are symmetrizing this, and we'll just bring this down, grab the boundary, and we want to flatten this out or make it solid. So I'm just looking at this, kind of debating on how we deal with this shape. We could just extrude like so and just S, Y, 0, and now it'll suffice. And then of course clean mesh to remove any extra geometry. We'll select both of these and just perform a slash. And I'm looking at the clock to see how long I'm in on the video. And we can just, let's go ahead and just take this moment to smart apply, the smartest thing to do right now. And we'll select these 2 points and just perform a bevel. So even though I kind of destroyed the curvature right there for a second, it doesn't matter because we're actually going to be terminating all this area and just bringing it in like so. In order to get this result, we could Alt X and mirror. So always press X to reset the mirror. One of my favorite functions of mirror. I'm not sure who came up with that, but resetting mirror with X is just the bee's knees to me. So things didn't work out with us trying to bevel this, and I must know why. Let's try that again. Let's select everything, Shift N to check those normals, and it looks like we have a normals issue. It's not going to make itself visually apparent to us, so we got to press Alt V and go to face orientation. And let's just look at this, and everything's looking good. I guess we don't have a normals issue. Pardon me. We'll just keep going. So we already smart applied on this, which means that we can just slide this back, grab this, bevel. And with me and these sort of things, I always work non-destructive for a period of time, and then I begin applying things in order to begin progressing to the next level, because I don't know, it's just the way Blender is. Trying to keep everything live for as long as possible is also fun. It's a fun way to challenge yourself, but it could also result in you having a little bit of modifier madness near the end there. So sometimes there's less madness in just applying things sometimes, but that's just a tip from me. So now we've performed a difference on this. We can actually look at the front, and we'll select both of these and perform a difference, except we want to bring back this shape because we don't want a difference. We want to solidify it and then perform a difference. And we can start worrying about taking away some not so deep areas, because if we cut all the way through, it'll get boring. But if we begin working our way through the surface just a little bit at a time, we can keep things interesting until the end as far as creating interesting shapes here. But like I said, this is a type of tool test that I do. Sometimes I'll just wake up and get on the computer BSing with the team and just be cutting some sphericals. There I am about to use box cutter for this. And when we do the box cutter update that's coming out, I'll also be doing a demo for that more than likely. And it looks like we can bring it in on this auto smooth, but we don't want to bring it in so much that we start catching the wrong area. And so about there is good. And then we can Shift A, add a cylinder. We'll sharpen it just to smooth it out. and basically also give it auto smooth. Select both of these, perform a difference, Q, solidify. Let's say we want this even smoother. Let's alt click on subdivision, which will give us a subdivision first on the stack, and then we can just put a decimate at the end to get rid of any redundant geometry. And here we are looking at our shape so far. So just like that, we've gone in and just made a very quick spherical without a whole lot of work, just a warm up. You could literally detail on these as long as you want. In fact, sometimes I apply a certain stack of modifiers only to add an entirely brand new stack of modifiers. I'm just checking to see if there's any doubles in between these edges I'm trying to select. And we want to select here to here, but we don't want that selected. And just a couple of counter bevels just to work against the bevels that we have. We'll symmetrize that to the other side. And things are looking good so far with our sphere. We're looking pretty. We're feeling pretty. Just kidding. So what I'll do at this point is hold shift and shift click smart apply. And that will allow me to grab a derived version of a mesh just for a moment. And we can just delete everything else that isn't what was selected. And let's just start cleaning up crime in this city. So we just want to get rid of some extra points that aren't needed. We can press GG and hold Alt to kind of extend it beyond the initial point that exists. And we can do the same thing here. GG, hold Alt to extend it past the point in which it exists. And we'll just grab these 2 points and press Ctrl Shift B in order to bevel these points and just roll the wheel. And from here, we can actually go under Mesh Tools and choose Curve Extract. Sometimes my brain wanders while I'm pondering my next move, but there should be no pondering here. And for some reason, the smooth shading just looks so weird right there. And I may never know why. So let's actually convert to mesh. And we'll just mark it sharp and ignore that we ever saw that. Let's just mirror this across. And that did not work out. Let's try it again, Alt X. And we mirrored using symmetry. We don't want to do that. We want to press X, my favorite mirror hotkey, to reset it back to the most defaultest of default settings that would be required. And we could even, from this point, about to use a little box cutter. Let's not. Nothing against box cutter. And we will Control click Curve Extract, which will give us a new mesh. We could press Alt S to bring it out. We could S Y to bring it in. And to get my edge boundary selection, I have this mapped to Shift tilde, but it's under Select Loops, under Select Boundary Loops. And you can just press F, and we'll just put a bevel on that, and maybe roll the wheel. Control A, apply to scale, and wonder why our auto smooth just looks so terrible. Let's give it sharpening, and that'll actually do the job. I was about to hit it with some sub D first, just to let you know, like sometimes I'll look at some rounding and it's just an unacceptable state. So when it can be helped, you best deal with it. But if it can't be helped, then it just can't be helped. But just know that most cases it can definitely be helped. You know, my motto is, you know, to mitigate where you cut your corners at to an area where the corners you're cutting won't be noticed to be cut. But if your corners are being cut right in front of my face, I'll have to ask about that. Be like, hey, see some cut corners here. You should mitigate those to the back of the model. So we'll just bevel this in solid mode so we see what's happening. And this bevel just kind of looks a little weird, but you know what? We won't talk about that. E, Y, and let's just delete that edge. Let's delete that edge, select these verts, Control Shift B, bevel. Such a complicated hotkey sometimes. And from this point, we can just curve extract. And we see why things got weird. So let's Control A, apply our scale. And we never applied our scale when we were dealing with that area. So that's just something we will have to live with. But just know that I will be awake at night thinking about why I didn't apply scale at that point. So we'll just bring this in, select both of these, mirror to the other side. And that'll just be my cross to bear. So here we are just looking at just the very quickest of sphericals. In fact, a very popular trick that I like to play with every morning is reverse bevel, where you perform a Boolean and then you select a cutter and select just the top face and control click mark in order to bevel it in a reverse fashion. And that gets you something like this, which is always just nice to see on a model. So we could Shift A, bring in a cube. Let's bring our cube out. You know, really just slayed this thing with cubes. Cube warrior, hashtag cube warrior. So, just kidding. There's greater cube warriors out there than I. In fact, I feel like there's still another 10,000 hours to put in just a cube to truly unlock all of the mysteries behind it. So let's Shift A, bring in a cube, adding another 3 experience points to our gauge. It's like just killing bunnies over and over, just with cubes. And cubes are the geometrically least expensive shapes you can use for a Boolean, might I add. With circles and spheres and cylinders being the most expensive. You start cutting into those, you're putting in 32 rounds of WTF in your mesh, and you'll have to deal with that someday. So I always think about how many loops I'm putting in via the Boolean, via the bevels that I have on my cutters. If that's something that I want to deal with later, we'll modify or mirror that to the bottom. And let's actually bring back this shape through our Everscroll, and I'm going to Shift D it to duplicate and just give us a unique version. And we'll make this sink into this shape, but how far is the question? Maybe like so. And this is giving us a rather unique result. So let's Shift A, bring in a cylinder, one of these 32 round bad boys straight to the dome. And we can just bring this out, and we'll just select both of them, perform a difference, then just use Everscroll to bring back our last cutter. Whenever you use Everscroll, it automatically defaults to the last cutter, which is one of my favorite behaviors about it. Also feels like my modal distance is a little out of control, right? I'm having to move the mouse a mile. That's something that you can always adjust in your preferences if that's an issue, but we'll just keep rolling. Scale it down. We don't want it too dominating, but just enough. And we could even bring that back, select this area, put our origin there. Let's just Shift D, place it here, and also perform a difference, giving us 3. 3 is better than 1. And this is us looking at our spherical so far. So really we could just keep on keeping on with this thing until it's as detailed as the day is long. But I wanted to keep it real brief to just kind of show a little bit of me using this latest HardOps in action to you know, inspire, hopefully, not to ever demotivate. Sometimes users report that you know, they see these tool demos and they're like, oh man, I'll never be able to get that good. I sure hope you do, man, because these are knuckle poppers. You should be able to do these just to say, you know, I just warmed up with the tools now. I'm ready to get to the real work ahead. So I'm going to Shift A, add another cube. I bet you did not guess that. And we'll press SZ and just bring this in. And let's grab these edges. And before we can even bevel them, we need to apply scale in object mode. You know, thinking ahead. And let's just select both of them, difference. But we actually want that shape back. But we don't want that shape back. We want a solid duplicate. So by shift clicking shade solid, it will duplicate the shape and give you a solid version. And then we can actually scale this version down. We can press I, inset, extrude it back, and just place it in our form. Select both of them, mirror it to the other side. And this is us just adding some additional detail to this particular area just on the fly. So like I said, you could just continue detailing the shape all day, and this process hopefully should assist users with you know, getting acquainted with the toolkit that they're looking at, because in a way this is all Blender. You know, you got to understand Blender. That's the main thing. In fact, I'm going to power save this. Powered by power save. We'll call this spherical, almost typed in power save because I was saying that. We can see it's spherical number 20. And let's talk about promoting this to a bevel. So let's look at this shape. If we were to just go in and press Q and control click bevel, we're going to get a result like this. So it's like, how do we make this work out? How do we make this work out? Well, first of all, the bevel didn't even get all the way across the form. So let's go in and Alt scroll bevel to roll it back a little bit. And we just want to grab the right areas. We want to Alt click sharpen to put away at normal, and that suffices. We can send that on and call it a day, except this, and this. These things won't go. So how do we solve them when the modifiers are still alive? Well, that brings me to one of my new favorites of Blender 2.8 era, and that's the weld. So we can just roll the weld until we eat our lunch, and then roll it up one in order to bring it up just enough to help the bevel, which is just my favorite way to interface with weld when it comes to HardOps. We could take this piece, for example, and just control click bevel in order to do the same thing. And we see that, you know, things look okay. In fact, Alt clicking sharpen, we could probably help that area a little bit. Whenever it comes to rendering, I'm less obsessive about these areas because, you know, once you have the materials on, everything just kind of goes together and the bevel just really takes front row. However, this area is just such a curiosity to me. Let's press Alt V and just look at the wireframe. You know, and I think it's that weld is just eating some serious lunch down there. And we can just press Alt V, turn off wireframe, and that area will live. So this area is an interesting one. One of the cuts that people often ask about is how I do, well, radials. So let's just select both of these, select slash. And what I want to do is Shift A, add a cube, and reset its position. And we'll just position it here and just scale this out. And this is our cutter so far. And if we were to control click radial array, it'll radiate, but we need to apply to scale. So let's go in and click it again. And we see that we're now radial arraying around our cursor, but our cursor isn't centered. So we need to press Shift C to get our cursor back in the center. And then from here, we can control click radial array in order to radial array this around the form. And we'll just select this and Q indifference to perform one of these cuts. And so now we have little ticks happening along the top. And we could even continue on with our modification onslaught of just bringing back one of these bad boys, the classic long boy Bud Ice Cube. And we'll just Control A, apply our scale, grab these two edges, and I'm almost at the 20-minute mark. And we could just select both of them, difference, and we performed a difference using fast. But I'm going to bring this in and let's promote this to a bevel as well. And we see that things almost work out, except that there's a little bit of spice happening near these edges. So same trick, we'll bring in a weld and just roll the weld until we eat the bevel's lunch. And we may want to bring it back a little bit because we're eating the wrong bevel's lunch. But now when we roll it up one, we see that we get a nice looking shape, because with the weld modifier there's not a lot of feedback happening. So using it after the bevel just kind of lets you know about how much distance that you're eating. And so same thing here, we can just promote this, and this geometry is actually a lot simpler than it should be. And because it's destructive, we can clean this up ourselves like a boss, because really these things are often caused by just near misses. If we really wanted to baby this area, we could, but we would need to also apply some things. So instead it's just easier to mitigate it. Also, in the grand scheme of this model, how many people are going to be zooming in exactly right here and critiquing your work to tell you how terrible you are? Probably not a lot. Such negativity probably isn't needed in your life as it is, but you know, we want to continue on. Let's take a look at this. So we finally have almost nailed all of our pieces. In fact, if we look at this, we can see that the bevel didn't actually catch that area. Now it looks good. And we could even clean this up just a tad, and that will mitigate the shading issues happening on the other side. So if we control click bevel, we can now bring this back in, And this is our result so far. So it looks like we also will need our boy weld, and we just roll it in just a little bit, bring it up one, and that is as good as it gets. I mean, we could take it even further and could just continue modifying and refining this until the end, but I'm just going to control click blank material to just slap a random unique material on everything. And from here, let's just jump it over to render and just see what our results are so far. We'll select this and just control roll through material scroll until we find just the right material. We'll select this piece, roll through material scroll on control click until we just find the nice shade of metal that suits our needs. And this is our result so far. Keep in mind, I also enjoy Shift A, adding a cube, pressing Q, and using sphere cast in order to cast it into a sphere, and then of course giving it a sub D level of 4. So we could bring it in probably about maybe about there. Alright, and we want to smooth it, but we don't want to sharpen it because the same issue from before will happen. But let's just Shift A, add a cube, maybe turn on our overlay so we can see what's happening, and we'll select it all the way to here, select both of them, difference, and with this shape we can just shift click blank material to just give it a glass. And now this is our result. So it's just a sphere under glass. I always enjoy putting these objects under glass, and then from here pressing Alt V B and just scrolling through various light setups till I find something that truly flatters the surface, and then Alt V B or Alt V V, sorry, and we can start going through the environments. So something like that will do the job for this. And after turning off overlays, we can now see the result of just a quick 20 minutes of just warming up inside of HardOps, just playing around. So with that, I'll wrap up this video, and I'll see you guys next time, and thank you for watching.